The church bells echoed softly across the quiet town as mourners gathered beneath a gray autumn sky to say goodbye to Andrew Holloway. The respected businessman had spent decades building a reputation for generosity, success, and calm leadership. His sudden death from what doctors initially ruled a heart attack had stunned neighbors, business partners, and longtime friends alike. Outside the old stone church, bouquets of white lilies lined the entrance while black umbrellas dotted the walkway, despite the light drizzle that barely touched the ground. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with whispered condolences and restrained grief. Family photographs rested beside Andrew's polished mahogany casket, each image portraying a smiling man whose life appeared flawless. To everyone present, he had been the devoted husband, the dependable employer, and the trusted friend. No one questioned that image. No one imagined the carefully crafted life displayed in those photographs concealed fractures that had remained hidden behind closed doors. Claire Holloway sat alone in the front pew, dressed in a simple black dress that matched the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She accepted quiet embraces and sympathetic words with polite nods, thanking each visitor while struggling to maintain her composure. Every few moments, she glanced toward the casket, searching for emotions she could no longer identify. Grief weighed heavily upon her, yet beneath it lingered something darker, an ache born long before Andrew's death. Their marriage had once been filled with affection and shared ambitions. Over the years, however, Andrew had become increasingly distant. Long business trips replaced family dinners, unexplained late nights became routine, and conversations slowly dissolved into uncomfortable silence. Claire had noticed the changes but convinced herself they were temporary, refusing to confront fears she could never fully explain. She buried every suspicion beneath hope, believing patience could restore what love had gradually lost. The minister delivered a heartfelt eulogy describing Andrew as a man whose kindness had shaped countless lives. Around the church, mourners quietly wiped away tears. Claire lowered her gaze, unable to reconcile the glowing portrait being painted with the lonely reality she had privately endured. She neither interrupted nor corrected the comforting narrative. Some truths, she believed, belonged only to the dead. When the service concluded, the crowd slowly followed the casket toward the cemetery overlooking rolling hills beyond town. Cool wind stirred fallen leaves across the narrow paths as prayers were spoken over Andrew's grave. Flowers accumulated around the polished headstone, while one mourner after another offered final farewells before beginning the quiet journey home. Claire remained standing long after most guests drifted away. She stared silently at the fresh earth, feeling strangely detached from the ceremony unfolding around her. For a brief moment, she thought the silence might finally allow her to breathe. Then she noticed the woman. Standing several yards away beneath a large oak tree was an elegant stranger wearing a fitted black coat and dark gloves. Her posture was perfectly composed, her expression unreadable. Unlike the others, she carried no flowers and spoke to no one. Her attention never wandered from Claire. She simply watched with unnerving patience, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. Claire frowned, searching her memory. She was certain they had never met. Their eyes locked across the cemetery. The stranger offered the faintest smile. It wasn't warm. It wasn't sympathetic. Felt like recognition. A quiet unease settled over Claire's chest. She considered walking toward the woman to ask who she was. But before she could move, the stranger calmly stepped forward through the remaining mourners. Her pace was measured, almost graceful, attracting little attention from anyone nearby. Within seconds, she stood only a few feet away. Claire opened her mouth to speak. "You took everything from me," the woman whispered. Before anyone understood her words, she reached beneath her coat and produced a gleaming knife. The first stab landed so quickly that several witnesses believed Claire had simply stumbled. The second sent horrified screams echoing across the cemetery. Flowers scattered across the wet grass as mourners rushed backward in panic. Someone shouted for help while others froze in disbelief, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before their eyes. Claire collapsed beside Andrew's grave, her trembling hand reaching instinctively toward the fresh soil as crimson spread across her black dress. The mysterious woman stood over her for one haunting second, breathing heavily, her face strangely calm despite the horror surrounding her. Then distant sirens pierced the silence. As terrified witnesses struggled to describe what they had just seen, one question echoed through every frightened mind. Who was the woman who had turned a funeral into a murder scene? The cemetery remained sealed long after the ambulance disappeared beyond the town limits. Yellow evidence markers surrounded Andrew Holloway's grave while officers carefully photographed every footprint, discarded flower, and blood-stained patch of grass. What had begun as a respectful farewell had become the county's most shocking homicide in decades. The haunting image of Claire collapsing beside her husband's coffin spread through every witness statement. Yet no one could explain the identity of the woman who had attacked her in broad daylight. Detective Ethan Brooks arrived before sunset, quietly studying the scene before speaking to anyone. With nearly 20 years of investigative experience, he had learned that first impressions often revealed more than emotional testimony. The cemetery still carried an unsettling silence, broken only by distant police radios and the rustling wind. Brooks noticed how the attack appeared precise rather than chaotic. Nothing suggested a spontaneous outburst. Every movement described by witnesses sounded deliberate. He separated mourners into small groups and patiently repeated the same questions. Did anyone recognize the woman? Had anyone spoken with her before the funeral? Did she arrive with another guest? Every answer ended the same way. Shaken faces offered apologetic shrugs, insisting they had never seen her before that afternoon. Some remembered her elegant black coat. Others recalled her calm expression. Nobody knew her name, and nobody understood why she had focused entirely on Claire. The investigation quickly shifted toward surveillance footage collected from nearby traffic cameras, the church entrance, and the cemetery gates. Brooks spent hours reviewing recordings frame by frame. The mysterious woman appeared nearly 40 minutes before the funeral service began. She parked several streets away, avoiding the main entrance despite numerous empty spaces nearby. Instead of walking directly inside, she circled the church once, observing arriving guests before quietly joining the crowd. She never greeted anyone, never signed the memorial book, and never removed her eyes from Claire for very long. To Brooks, the footage eliminated any possibility of sudden emotional collapse. The woman had arrived with a purpose. She patiently waited through prayers, hymns, and the burial itself before choosing the exact moment when most mourners had begun leaving. It resembled planning, not passion. While forensic teams searched for fingerprints and DNA, detectives requested access to Andrew Holloway's electronic records. His primary cell phone contained little beyond ordinary business calls and family messages. However, a digital specialist soon uncovered a second encrypted phone registered under a shell company. Hidden within it were hundreds of deleted conversations exchanged across several years with a contact saved simply as V. After recovering the messages, investigators finally uncovered a full name, Vanessa Reed. The conversations painted an intimate relationship stretching back nearly 4 years. Andrew repeatedly promised that his marriage would soon end, assuring Vanessa they would eventually begin a life together. Weekend trips, expensive gifts, secret apartments, and emotional declarations filled the recovered messages. Yet the promises were endlessly delayed. Whenever Vanessa demanded certainty, Andrew offered another excuse, another deadline, another reassurance that patience would solve everything. Brooks wondered whether broken promises had become something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, officers searching the Holloway residence discovered several handwritten journals tucked inside a bedroom cabinet. They belonged to Claire. The entries revealed loneliness far deeper than anyone had imagined. Claire described countless evenings spent alone while Andrew claimed urgent business obligations. She admitted noticing unfamiliar perfume lingering on his clothes, unexplained charges on financial statements, and late-night phone calls abruptly ending whenever she entered the room. Although she never found undeniable proof, she repeatedly wrote about believing another woman existed somewhere beyond the carefully protected lies. One entry stopped Brooks cold. "I know she's real," Claire had written months earlier. "I just don't know who she is. Perhaps one day she'll stop hiding, and when she does, everything will finally make sense." Closing the journal, Brooks stared silently through the evidence room window, realizing Claire's unanswered question had finally been answered in the most horrifying way imaginable, while Vanessa Reed remained missing without a trace. As Detective Ethan Brooks organized the growing collection of evidence, one fact became impossible to ignore. Neither Claire Holloway nor Vanessa Reed had truly understood the man whose death had brought them together in tragedy. To discover why one woman had died and the other had vanished, Brooks realized he first needed to understand Andrew Holloway long before the funeral, before the bloodshed, and before every carefully hidden lie finally surfaced. 8 months earlier, the Holloway residence had appeared peaceful from the outside. Fresh flowers decorated the front porch, neighbors waved as they drove past, and Andrew still greeted everyone with the confident smile that had earned widespread admiration throughout the town. Behind the front door, however, silence had slowly replaced warmth. Claire noticed the changes long before she admitted them to herself. Andrew no longer lingered over breakfast conversations. His phone remained face down whenever they shared meals, vibrating constantly with messages he dismissed as work emergencies. Business trips that once lasted a single night gradually stretched into entire weekends. When Claire asked simple questions about his schedule, Andrew answered politely but vaguely, always insisting that expanding the company demanded greater sacrifices from both of them. She wanted to believe him. Instead, doubt quietly settled into every empty evening she spent alone. There were no dramatic arguments, no broken furniture, and no shouting matches that neighbors could overhear. Their marriage unraveled through smaller wounds. Forgotten anniversaries became routine. Promises to spend time together were postponed again and again. Andrew apologized often enough to sound sincere but never changed his behavior afterward. Claire convinced herself exhaustion explained everything. She feared that pressing harder might drive him even farther away. Across town, another woman lived inside an entirely different version of Andrew Holloway. Vanessa Reed first met him during a regional business conference nearly 4 years earlier. Charming, attentive, and remarkably patient, Andrew listened as though every word she spoke genuinely mattered. He claimed his marriage had become little more than a legal arrangement sustained by shared finances and public appearances. According to him, Claire had emotionally abandoned the relationship years earlier, leaving them trapped together until complicated investments could be untangled without destroying both families financially. Vanessa believed every word. Andrew never spoke cruelly about Claire. Instead, he portrayed himself as a man carrying impossible responsibilities with quiet dignity. He insisted divorce would come eventually but begged Vanessa to remain patient until the timing became financially safe. Each promise sounded reasonable. Each delay felt temporary. Whenever frustration surfaced, Andrew responded with affection, expensive gifts, and carefully chosen words that restored her confidence. "You deserve a future with me," he often whispered. "I just need a little more time." Months turned into years. Neither woman realized they were hearing opposite versions of the same story. Whenever Claire questioned Andrew's growing distance, he insisted expanding his business would secure their future together. Whenever Vanessa worried he would never leave his wife, he described himself as already emotionally divorced, trapped only by legal obligations beyond his control. Every conversation strengthened one relationship while quietly weakening the other. The manipulation extended beyond words. Andrew maintained separate phones, separate calendars, and separate credit cards. Hotel reservations appeared under company accounts. Gifts purchased for Vanessa were disguised as corporate expenses. Even his travel schedules were carefully arranged so neither woman could easily discover overlapping timelines. Every detail reflected planning rather than coincidence. Still, deception rarely remains invisible forever. One rainy evening, Claire found a restaurant receipt tucked inside Andrew's jacket pocket. The reservation listed dinner for two at an upscale waterfront restaurant on a night he had supposedly attended a business seminar in another city. She stared at the receipt for several minutes before quietly placing it back where she had found it. When Andrew returned home, she almost confronted him. Instead, she simply asked whether the trip had gone well. He smiled without hesitation. "It was exhausting," he replied. "Couldn't wait to come home." Claire forced herself to smile in return, but something inside her quietly fractured. For the first time, hope no longer outweighed suspicion. Somewhere beyond Andrew's effortless lies, another life existed, one she could sense but could not yet see. Unaware that investigators would someday reconstruct every hidden conversation, Andrew continued living between two worlds, never imagining both would soon collide with devastating consequences. Andrew Holloway believed he could continue balancing two separate lives forever. He underestimated how fragile deception became once promises started colliding with reality. While Claire silently questioned the growing distance inside their marriage, Vanessa Reed measured every passing week against the future Andrew repeatedly described but never delivered. What had once felt like a passionate secret slowly evolved into something darker, where love no longer inspired hope but demanded certainty. At first, Vanessa accepted Andrew's explanations without hesitation. Whenever he canceled dinner because of unexpected meetings or postponed another weekend away together, she reminded herself of everything he had sacrificed. Andrew spoke with convincing sincerity, insisting lawyers were reviewing financial documents and accountants were untangling complicated investments. Divorce, he promised, was inevitable. He simply refused to leave Claire without enough financial security to prevent public humiliation or unnecessary hardship. Those words comforted Vanessa for a while. She admired what she interpreted as compassion. Andrew presented himself as an honorable man trying to end a failed marriage with dignity rather than cruelty. Vanessa often imagined the day he would arrive at her apartment carrying nothing except a suitcase, finally free from the life he claimed had already ended emotionally years before. But reality refused to match his promises. Another holiday passed, then another anniversary. Each celebration Andrew spent beside Claire felt like another betrayal of everything he had whispered during countless private evenings. Vanessa found herself checking social media for photographs from charity events, business galas, and neighborhood gatherings where Andrew and Claire still appeared together, smiling naturally for cameras. Every image planted fresh doubts she struggled to silence. When she questioned him directly, Andrew always had an answer. The appearances mean nothing, he insisted. People expect us to look united until everything is finalized. She wanted to believe him, yet belief demanded increasing effort. Vanessa's emotional world gradually narrowed until nearly every thought centered on Andrew. She rearranged her work schedule whenever he unexpectedly became available. She ignored invitations from friends, canceled family gatherings, and abandoned hobbies she once enjoyed. Her happiness depended entirely upon his messages, his visits, and his promises. When hours passed without hearing from him, anxiety settled heavily over her mind. She began reading old conversations repeatedly, searching for reassurance hidden inside familiar words. One evening, while waiting inside Andrew's apartment during one of his brief visits, Vanessa noticed a leather folder left carelessly on the kitchen table. She had never searched through his belongings before, but curiosity overcame hesitation. Inside were financial documents detailing trusts, insurance policies, investment accounts, and property agreements. Claire's name appeared almost everywhere. Andrew had established substantial protections ensuring his wife would inherit the family home, significant savings, and lifetime financial support regardless of any future divorce settlement. Several documents had been updated only weeks earlier. Vanessa stared at the papers in disbelief. The man who constantly claimed he was merely waiting to separate had quietly strengthened Claire's financial future instead. When Andrew returned, he immediately realized she had seen the folder. "It's not what you think," he said calmly. "Then explain it." "I have legal obligations. Protecting Claire financially keeps everything peaceful." Vanessa searched his face for honesty. Peaceful for who? Andrew stepped closer, attempting to reassure her with familiar tenderness. "None of this changes us." But something had already changed. Driving home that night, Vanessa replayed every conversation they had ever shared. Each delayed promise suddenly appeared less like temporary necessity and more like deliberate manipulation. Every explanation sounded rehearsed. Every affectionate gesture felt strategically timed whenever she began questioning him. Jealousy slowly hardened into resentment. In Vanessa's mind, Claire stopped being an unseen wife caught inside an unhappy marriage. She became the obstacle preventing happiness, the woman receiving security, loyalty, and public respect while Vanessa remained hidden in the shadows, surviving on promises that never arrived. She convinced herself Andrew truly loved her, but lacked the courage to remove the final barrier standing between them. That belief became dangerously intoxicating. From that moment forward, Vanessa no longer viewed Claire as another victim of Andrew's deception. Instead, she began seeing her as the thief who had stolen the future Andrew had promised belonged to her alone, never realizing someone else was quietly setting far deadlier events into motion. Detective Ethan Brooks could no longer view the cemetery attack as an isolated act of jealousy. Every witness statement, recovered message, and page from Claire's journals suggested a tangled web of deception stretching far beyond the funeral itself. Vanessa Reed remained the primary suspect in Claire's murder, yet Brooks sensed another truth still lay buried beneath the evidence. If Andrew Holloway had manipulated two women for years, perhaps his own death deserved far closer examination. The official medical report listed cardiac arrest caused by a severe heart attack. Andrew had collapsed alone inside his home 3 days before the funeral and had been pronounced dead shortly after emergency responders arrived. Because he had a family history of heart disease and no immediate signs of violence, the county medical examiner had found little reason to suspect foul play. Now, Brooks wasn't convinced. During a late-night review of the autopsy photographs, one detail caught his attention. Andrew's fingernails displayed a faint bluish discoloration inconsistent with the initial diagnosis. The observation might have meant nothing on its own, but combined with subtle irritation found inside the stomach lining, it raised questions the original examination had never fully explored. Brooks requested additional laboratory testing using preserved tissue and blood samples. Several anxious days later, the toxicology report arrived. The results stunned everyone in the investigation room. Trace amounts of an extremely rare plant-derived poison were detected in Andrew's bloodstream. The concentration was small but medically significant, capable of triggering fatal cardiac complications while closely resembling a natural heart attack. Without specialized testing, the toxin could easily remain unnoticed, especially in a patient with existing cardiovascular risk factors. Andrew Holloway had almost certainly been poisoned. Silence filled the conference room as detectives absorbed the implications. What if the funeral wasn't the beginning? One investigator quietly asked. Brooks nodded. It may have started with Andrew. The investigation expanded immediately. Detectives obtained pharmacy records, financial transactions, travel histories, and surveillance footage covering Andrew's final weeks. They interviewed coworkers, household staff, restaurant employees, and neighbors, searching for any unusual encounter that might explain how the poison had reached him. Nothing obvious appeared. Instead, every answer generated new uncertainty. Andrew had eaten meals at different restaurants, attended business meetings across several cities, and entertained guests inside his office almost daily. The poison could have been administered through food, drink, medication, or even a carefully prepared supplement. Too many opportunities existed, and too many people had access to him. Attention inevitably returned to Vanessa. Her messages revealed growing frustration during the weeks before Andrew's death. Several exchanges showed her demanding immediate action instead of endless promises. In one conversation she wrote, "I'm tired of waiting while she gets everything." Andrew responded by asking for patience and assuring her that everything would soon change. Those words carried a chilling new meaning. Did everything refer to divorce? Or something far darker? Brooks refused to jump to conclusions. Emotional messages alone could not prove murder. Yet he also couldn't ignore how Vanessa's anger had steadily intensified before Andrew suddenly died. Then another discovery complicated the case even further. Phone records revealed Andrew attempted calling Vanessa repeatedly during the 24 hours before his death. None of the calls connected. Instead, he left 2 brief voicemail messages sounding unusually tense. The first simply asked her to return his call. The second was far more unsettling. "Something's gone wrong," Andrew said. "We need to talk before anyone else finds out." The message ended abruptly. Detectives replayed the recording several times, searching for hidden clues inside his strained voice. If Andrew feared exposure, what exactly had he discovered? Brooks also noticed something else. Although Vanessa clearly hated Claire by the time of the funeral, none of her earlier communications expressed any desire to harm her physically. Her anger focused almost entirely on Andrew's broken promises. Claire appeared repeatedly as a rival, but Andrew remained the person controlling every decision. That realization introduced a terrifying possibility. Perhaps Andrew had always been Vanessa's true target. If he died before fulfilling his promises, grief, betrayal, and rage could easily have redirected toward the woman Vanessa believed had stolen the life she deserved. Claire might never have been the original victim. She may simply have become the final object of an obsession that Andrew himself had created. As investigators continued tracing Andrew's final movements, Brooks understood the case had transformed from a straightforward homicide into something far more disturbing. Somewhere within Andrew Holloway's carefully managed double life existed the missing piece explaining not only his own mysterious death, but also the brutal violence that erupted beside his grave. And finding that answer would require looking beyond romance toward an even deeper conspiracy. The theory that Andrew Holloway had been poisoned changed the direction of the investigation overnight. Detective Ethan Brooks no longer viewed the funeral stabbing as the inevitable result of a bitter affair alone. Someone had manipulated events long before Claire collapsed beside Andrew's grave. The unanswered question was whether Claire had accidentally stumbled into that hidden plan or whether she had unknowingly become one of its intended targets. Searching for answers, Brooks returned to the Holloway home. The house felt strangely frozen in time. Claire's coffee cup still rested on the kitchen counter where she had left it before the funeral. Andrew's reading glasses remained beside an unfinished newspaper. Every room reflected ordinary routines interrupted by extraordinary violence. While forensic technicians continued examining financial documents and electronic devices, Brooks requested another interview with the person who had known Claire better than anyone else. Rebecca Miles arrived that afternoon. She had been Claire's closest friend for nearly 15 years, standing beside her through birthdays, family celebrations, illnesses, and the slow decline of her marriage. Unlike many witnesses, Rebecca did not begin with speculation. She quietly described the woman Claire had become during the final months of her life. She wasn't afraid of another woman anymore, Rebecca said softly. She became afraid of what Andrew was hiding. Brooks leaned forward. What do you mean? Rebecca hesitated before reaching inside her handbag and removing a folded envelope. Claire gave me this a week before Andrew died. She told me to keep it somewhere safe. Inside were several photocopied financial documents. The records showed substantial sums of money moving through unfamiliar companies over the previous 18 months. Properties had quietly changed ownership. Investment accounts had been emptied and reopened under different corporate names. Insurance beneficiaries appeared to have been updated repeatedly. None of the transactions looked immediately illegal, but together they formed a complicated pattern Claire had found deeply unsettling. According to Rebecca, Claire discovered the paperwork accidentally while searching Andrew's office for an old insurance certificate. She told me Andrew became furious when he realized she'd been inside that room. Rebecca recalled. I'd never seen her so shaken. Brooks carefully examined every page. Most companies listed existed only on paper, registered through legal firms outside the county. Several transferred funds between one another within days, creating trails that seemed intentionally confusing. Andrew's signature appeared throughout the documents, but other names surfaced repeatedly beside his. One signature caught Brooks's attention. It belonged to a financial consultant named Marcus Ellison. The name had never appeared during earlier interviews. Detectives immediately began researching Ellison's connection to Andrew. Public records identified him as an investment advisor specializing in asset restructuring for wealthy clients. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. Yet transaction histories revealed Ellison had personally authorized several transfers only weeks before Andrew's death. Brooks wondered why Claire had become so frightened. Rebecca answered before he even asked. She believed Andrew was preparing for something, she said quietly. Not retirement, not divorce. Something bigger. Claire had never explained exactly what she meant, but she repeatedly told Rebecca that Andrew seemed unusually nervous whenever financial matters arose. He started locking his office door, shredding paperwork late at night, and taking private phone calls outside the house. Whenever Claire asked questions, he dismissed them with vague explanations about confidential business negotiations. She stopped believing him. Among Claire's journal entries, Brooks found another passage written only days before Andrew died. "If anything happens, people will think I'm imagining things. But money doesn't disappear without a reason, and Andrew isn't telling me the truth anymore. Someone else is involved." Brooks closed the journal slowly. Until now, Vanessa Reed had appeared to be the center of every mystery. But Claire's discoveries suggested another circle of secrecy operating beneath the affair itself. Andrew had hidden far more than an unfaithful relationship. His financial dealings hinted at partnerships, concealed assets, and unknown associates whose motives remained completely unexplored. The investigation could no longer focus solely on jealousy or revenge. It had become a search for whoever benefited most from Andrew's death. As detectives prepared warrants for Marcus Ellison's financial records and business communications, Brooks looked once more at Claire's copied documents. The numbers alone meant little, but together they resembled pieces of a carefully constructed puzzle. Somewhere inside those transactions lay the reason Andrew had been poisoned, Claire had been murdered, and Vanessa had vanished, bringing the investigation to the edge of a conspiracy far larger than anyone had first imagined. The deeper detective Ethan Brooks dug into Andrew Holloway's hidden finances, the clearer it became that Claire's murder could not be explained by jealousy alone. Every newly uncovered document pointed toward planning, deception, and calculated decisions made long before the funeral. Yet one question continued haunting the investigation. If Vanessa Reed had acted entirely on her own, why did every detail of the attack seem so carefully rehearsed? Brooks returned to the beginning. Over the following days, he re-interviewed every witness who had attended Andrew's funeral. This time, he instructed each person to ignore the stabbing itself and instead describe everything they had noticed before the violence began. Small observations, he believed, often carried the greatest value once panic no longer clouded memory. Patterns soon emerged. Several mourners independently remembered seeing the elegant stranger arrive unusually early. She never entered conversations or accepted condolences. Instead, she quietly walked around the cemetery several times before the service started, pausing near different pathways and occasionally glancing toward the church entrance. At the time, her behavior seemed respectful rather than suspicious. Looking back, witnesses realized she had probably been studying the surroundings instead of mourning the deceased. One elderly groundskeeper provided an especially important detail. He recalled seeing the woman standing near Andrew's freshly prepared gravesite almost an hour before the funeral procession arrived. Believing she was a grieving relative seeking privacy, he left her alone. Only later did he remember watching her slowly pace the distance between the grave and the nearest exit, counting her steps beneath her breath before calmly walking away. Brooks immediately ordered another review of surveillance footage. Security cameras positioned near the church parking lot, cemetery entrance, and surrounding streets revealed additional evidence previously overlooked. Vanessa entered the cemetery carrying a modest handbag. Minutes later, after spending time alone near the grave, she briefly disappeared behind a maintenance building where no cameras reached. When she emerged, the handbag appeared noticeably flatter. Investigators searched the maintenance area. Hidden beneath loose wooden boards, forensic technicians recovered a torn fabric pouch containing microscopic traces of Claire's blood and fibers matching Vanessa's black gloves. The discovery suggested the murder weapon had been concealed before the ceremony rather than carried openly throughout the service. Every movement reflected preparation. Vanessa had selected her location. She had hidden the weapon. She had waited patiently. Most importantly, she attacked only after the minister completed the final prayer and mourners began dispersing, ensuring confusion would delay any coordinated response. The violence unfolded exactly when emotional attention shifted from Andrew's burial toward personal farewells. This was no uncontrollable emotional explosion. It was a carefully timed execution. Still, another mystery refused to disappear. While analyzing recordings from a traffic camera overlooking the cemetery's rear entrance, Brooks noticed an unfamiliar figure leaving the grounds less than 2 minutes after the stabbing. The individual wore a dark baseball cap, sunglasses, and a long raincoat despite the mild weather. Instead of running from the scene like frightened witnesses, the person walked calmly toward a waiting sedan parked beyond camera range. Detectives enlarged the footage repeatedly. The face remained hidden. License plate recognition failed because mud obscured several characters. Even so, one detail stood out. Moments before reaching the vehicle, the unidentified figure briefly turned toward the cemetery and appeared to check a cell phone. Seconds later, another nearby camera recorded the sedan leaving the area without attracting attention. Brooks compared the timestamp with emergency calls placed by witnesses. The unknown individual departed before police arrived, but after Vanessa had already attacked Claire. The timing seemed far too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Investigators reviewed Vanessa's recovered phone records once again. Surprisingly, no outgoing calls or text messages appeared during the funeral itself. Either she had acted without communication, or someone else had taken extraordinary care to erase every digital trace connecting them. Brooks stared silently at the blurred surveillance image displayed across the conference room screen. Vanessa had undoubtedly carried out the murder, but every new piece of evidence suggested she had not entered the cemetery believing she stood entirely alone. Somewhere beyond the visible tragedy, another person had watched events unfold exactly as planned, and finding that silent observer would become the investigation's most urgent priority before the conspiracy disappeared forever. The unidentified figure leaving the cemetery transformed the investigation from a straightforward murder inquiry into a hunt for unseen collaborators. Detective Ethan Brooks now believed Vanessa Reed had executed the fatal attack, but growing evidence suggested someone else had quietly influenced the events surrounding both Andrew and Claire Holloway. To uncover that hidden connection, investigators widened their focus beyond relationships and began dismantling Andrew's carefully protected financial empire. Search warrants revealed far more than anyone expected. Behind Andrew's polished public reputation existed an elaborate network of shell companies, private investment accounts, and insurance policies scattered across multiple jurisdictions. Millions of dollars had moved through businesses with little legitimate activity. Several property transfers carried signatures that handwriting experts quickly identified as sophisticated forgeries. Encrypted email accounts contained coded messages discussing account closures, confidential meetings, and unexplained deadlines only days before Andrew's sudden death. Marcus Ellison's name surfaced repeatedly. The financial advisor had authorized numerous transactions while maintaining frequent encrypted contact with Andrew. Yet when detectives questioned him, he denied any knowledge of illegal activity. He described every financial movement as routine estate planning requested by his client. Although Brooks suspected he was withholding information, nothing immediately connected Ellison to either poisoning or murder. Meanwhile, officers continued searching for Vanessa Reed. After nearly a week, an anonymous tip led authorities to an isolated lakeside cabin several counties away. She surrendered without resistance. Gone was the composed woman seen standing beneath the oak tree at Andrew's funeral. Vanessa appeared exhausted, emotionally shattered, and barely capable of maintaining eye contact. During the first hours of questioning, she answered only basic identification questions before retreating into silence. Brooks refused to pressure her. Instead, he quietly placed copies of Andrew's messages, financial records, and photographs from the cemetery across the interview table. Hours passed. Finally, Vanessa spoke. "You think I became this person overnight?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Brooks remained silent. "He promised me everything," she continued. "He promised I mattered." Over the following hours, years of emotional manipulation poured out in fragmented memories. Andrew had convinced her their future together was inevitable. Whenever she questioned his loyalty, he reassured her with elaborate explanations, expensive gifts, and carefully timed affection. He made her feel uniquely understood while slowly isolating her from everyone else who might challenge his version of reality. "I stopped trusting my own thoughts," she admitted. "I only trusted him." Brooks recognized the pattern immediately. Andrew had not merely maintained an affair. He had systematically shaped Vanessa's emotional dependence until his approval became the center of her entire identity. Then Vanessa revealed something that silenced everyone inside the room. "The last time I saw him," she said slowly, "he told me Claire would never survive the funeral." Brooks looked up sharply. "What exactly did he say?" Vanessa closed her eyes, struggling to remember. "He said everything would finally be over after the funeral. He told me not to interfere before then because the future belonged to us." The investigators exchanged uneasy glances. Brooks leaned forward. "Did he tell you to kill Claire?" "No." "Did he ask anyone else to hurt her?" "I don't know." She began crying quietly. "I thought he meant he'd finally leave her after he died." Those words wouldn't stop repeating inside my head. I convinced myself he wanted me to finish what destiny had already started. Her confession explained the emotional collapse that followed Andrew's death, but introduced an even darker possibility. If Vanessa remembered Andrew's words accurately, then Claire's death might not have been an unforeseen consequence of jealousy. Andrew himself may have expected violence surrounding his funeral. Brooks replayed the statement repeatedly in his mind. Why would a man anticipating an ordinary heart attack speak as though his widow would soon die? Had he sensed someone was threatening both of them? Or had he participated in a plan whose consequences spiraled beyond his control? Leaving the interrogation room, Brooks realized the investigation had crossed another dangerous threshold. Andrew Holloway's final conversation suggested he possessed knowledge that vanished with him, and somewhere within the remaining financial records and encrypted communications lay the truth capable of exposing not only his killers but everyone who had secretly benefited from the deadly chain of events. Months after Vanessa Reed's arrest, the courtroom filled with reporters, grieving relatives, and curious spectators determined to witness the case that had transformed an ordinary funeral into a national headline. Detective Ethan Brooks sat quietly behind the prosecution table, surrounded by countless files documenting poisoned blood samples, encrypted financial records, witness interviews, and years of carefully hidden deception. Even after months of investigation, one uncomfortable truth remained. Andrew Holloway had died before answering the questions only he could explain. The prosecution presented the case with unwavering confidence. According to their argument, Vanessa had allowed jealousy and obsession to consume her until murder became the only future she could imagine. They described her calculated arrival at the cemetery, the hidden knife, the rehearsed movements, and the deliberate decision to attack Claire during the emotional climax of the funeral. Surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and Vanessa's own statements formed a powerful narrative of premeditated violence carried out with chilling precision. Claire's family listened through tears. For them, the trial centered upon a simple reality. A beloved daughter, friend, and wife had been murdered without mercy. The defense did not deny Vanessa's responsibility. Instead, they challenged the assumption that her actions had developed in isolation. Psychologists specializing in coercive control testified that prolonged emotional manipulation could dramatically distort judgment, particularly when victims became isolated from independent support. They explained how repeated promises, alternating affection with disappointment, and carefully engineered dependence often produced obsessive emotional attachment. Vanessa, they argued, had gradually surrendered her identity to a man who constantly rewrote reality until she no longer trusted her own perceptions. The courtroom grew silent as excerpts from Andrew's recovered messages were read aloud. One message promised divorce within weeks. Another delayed the same promise for financial reasons. Months later, identical assurances appeared again, each accompanied by declarations of love that never translated into action. The pattern repeated relentlessly across 4 years, revealing manipulation disguised as devotion. Rebecca Miles then took the witness stand. Holding back tears, she described Claire's lonely final months, her growing suspicion that another woman existed, and her desperate hope that honesty might still save her marriage. She also explained Claire's discovery of Andrew's hidden financial records and the fear those documents had awakened shortly before his death. Claire blamed herself, Rebecca said quietly. She thought if she became a better wife, Andrew would come back. Her words echoed painfully through the courtroom. Vanessa lowered her head. For the first time, She fully understood that Claire had never been the confident rival she imagined. She had been another woman trapped inside Andrew's carefully constructed web of lies. During cross-examination, prosecutors reminded jurors that emotional suffering could never justify murder. Whatever manipulation Andrew had inflicted, Vanessa still made the conscious decision to conceal a weapon, wait for the perfect opportunity, and repeatedly stab an unarmed woman standing beside her husband's grave. The defense agreed. Responsibility could not disappear, but neither could context. Closing arguments left the jury confronting an agonizing moral question. Was Vanessa simply a calculating killer driven by jealousy, or had years of psychological exploitation shaped the desperate decisions that ultimately destroyed multiple lives? The evidence supported both interpretations without fully resolving either. After days of deliberation, the jury prepared to announce its verdict. As everyone rose inside the silent courtroom, Detective Brooks found himself thinking less about guilt than about the man whose manipulation had survived his own death. Andrew Holloway's lies had poisoned relationships long before poison entered his bloodstream, and Brooks knew the verdict would close only one chapter of the case because the unanswered mystery surrounding Andrew's financial conspiracy and final betrayal still demanded a truth waiting to be uncovered. The jury ultimately found Vanessa Reed guilty of Claire Holloway's murder, acknowledging both the calculated nature of the crime and the years of psychological manipulation that had shaped her fractured judgment. Although the verdict brought legal closure to one tragedy, Detective Ethan Brooks refused to consider the investigation complete. Too many unanswered questions still surrounded Andrew Holloway's mysterious death, the hidden financial network, and the unidentified figure seen leaving the cemetery moments after the stabbing. Brooks returned to the financial evidence one final time. Working alongside forensic accountants, he reconstructed every transfer, insurance policy, and corporate transaction connected to Andrew's businesses. Slowly, scattered numbers transformed into a clear pattern. Andrew had not merely hidden assets from his wife. He had built an elaborate fraud involving shell companies, falsified investment reports, and forged signatures that concealed millions of dollars from business partners and tax authorities alike. Marcus Ellison finally broke under mounting evidence. Facing charges of financial fraud, he agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. During a lengthy recorded interview, he revealed that Andrew had designed the entire scheme years earlier, using legitimate companies to disguise illegal transfers while promising enormous profits to trusted associates. As regulators quietly began examining suspicious transactions, Andrew panicked. He considered exposing everyone involved in exchange for immunity before the fraud inevitably collapsed. That decision sealed his fate. According to Ellison's testimony, another investor named Daniel Mercer secretly arranged Andrew's poisoning after learning he intended to cooperate with authorities. The rare toxin was administered during a private dinner disguised as a routine business meeting only 3 days before Andrew's death. Daniel disappeared shortly afterward, but was eventually arrested while attempting to leave the country using false identification. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Daniel confessed. "I couldn't let him destroy us all," he admitted. His statement finally explained the poisoning. Andrew had not been killed because of romance. He had been murdered to protect a criminal enterprise worth millions. Yet Brooks realized the financial conspiracy alone did not explain Claire's death. Reviewing Vanessa's testimony once again, he understood the final tragedy unfolded entirely inside the emotional prison Andrew had carefully constructed over 4 years. Vanessa genuinely believed Andrew intended to build a future with her. When he died unexpectedly before fulfilling those promises, grief twisted into obsession. She remembered his cryptic statement that Claire would never survive the funeral and interpreted it as permission, destiny, or unfinished instruction. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding born from years of manipulation. Andrew never directly ordered Claire's murder, but every lie he told, every false promise he made, and every emotional dependency he cultivated pushed Vanessa closer to the edge where reason collapsed beneath betrayal. By convincing 2 women that each threatened the other's happiness, he transformed victims into rivals while hiding his own crimes behind carefully rehearsed deception. Standing beside Andrew's grave months later, Brooks reflected upon the devastating chain of events. A fraudulent empire had inspired one murder. Emotional manipulation had inspired another. Neither tragedy existed independently. Each flowed naturally from Andrew's double life until truth itself became impossible to separate from illusion. The cemetery had grown quiet again, with fresh flowers resting beside both Andrew and Claire. Visitors saw only 2 neighboring graves, unaware of the countless lies buried beneath them. Brooks closed the final investigative file knowing every major question had finally been answered. Yet one painful reality remained impossible to escape. Had Andrew chosen honesty years earlier instead of deception, 3 lives might have followed entirely different paths, leaving only one final responsibility before the Holloway case could truly be laid to rest. Several months passed after the final convictions, and the headlines that had once dominated newspapers gradually disappeared from public conversation. Courtrooms emptied, evidence boxes were archived, and reporters moved on to newer tragedies. Yet for those whose lives had been forever altered by the Holloway case, the passage of time offered no simple relief. Justice had answered many legal questions, but it could never restore the future stolen by deception, obsession, and violence. Andrew Holloway's name remained permanently associated with 2 different crimes. Official records remembered him as the victim of a calculated poisoning carried out to protect a collapsing financial conspiracy. Those who knew the full investigation remembered something far more complicated. His years of lies, manipulation, and emotional control had quietly destroyed trust long before his own death. Although he never held the knife that ended Claire's life, every false promise and carefully crafted deception pushed vulnerable people toward irreversible choices. Claire Holloway was remembered differently. Friends refused to let her final moments define the woman she had been. They spoke instead of her generosity, quiet resilience, and unwavering kindness even during the loneliest years of her marriage. Rebecca Miles often recalled how Claire continued believing honesty could repair broken relationships, even after suspicion and disappointment had consumed nearly every part of her private life. That hope, Rebecca believed, deserved to survive long after tragedy had buried everything else. Determined to create something meaningful from unimaginable loss, Rebecca established the Claire Holloway Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of coercive control, emotional manipulation, and psychological abuse. The foundation partnered with counselors, legal advocates, and community organizations, helping people recognize warning signs before dangerous relationships reached irreversible consequences. Educational seminars, confidential support groups, and emergency assistance programs slowly expanded throughout neighboring communities. Rebecca insisted upon one guiding principle. Manipulation leaves invisible wounds, she often told volunteers. If we wait until bruises appear, we've already waited too long. Vanessa Reed began serving a lengthy prison sentence, carrying the unbearable weight of understanding exactly what she had done. During counseling sessions, she accepted responsibility without attempting to excuse her actions. She openly admitted that Andrew's manipulation explained her emotional collapse but never erased her personal accountability. In private letters she wrote to Rebecca, letters that never sought forgiveness, Vanessa expressed only sorrow that 2 women had been turned into enemies by a man who convinced each they were fighting for love instead of escaping deception. Rebecca never responded. Some wounds deserved compassion. Others simply required distance. Detective Ethan Brooks visited the cemetery one final time before officially closing the Holloway investigation. Fresh flowers rested beside Claire's grave, while Andrew's headstone stood several feet away beneath the same towering oak tree where witnesses first noticed the mysterious woman whose arrival changed countless lives forever. Brooks remained there quietly, reflecting upon every interview, every forensic report, and every heartbreaking testimony collected throughout the investigation. The case had taught him something he knew he would never forget. The most dangerous people were not always those who carried weapons or committed the final act of violence. Sometimes they were individuals who patiently manipulated trust, distorted reality, and convinced others to destroy themselves while keeping their own hands seemingly clean. By the time the truth finally emerged, the damage had already become impossible to undo. As Brooks walked away from the cemetery, the afternoon breeze carried fallen leaves across the quiet paths where grief had once erupted into horror. The graves remained still, but the lessons buried beneath them would continue echoing long after every witness had gone home. Betrayal could survive death itself, and sometimes the saddest funerals marked not the ending of a tragedy, but the beginning of one far darker than anyone could have imagined.